I do human subject research, and we fill out all these forms. These cells growing in these flasks are human cells that we use to grow virus. We're not growing virus. The bottom line question is the risk to your human subjects worth the experiments you want to do on? It's not infectious. It can just get into the cell and then it dies. So those kind of experiments we can do up here because that's a very safe virus to work with. So it's a detailed risk-benefit assessment. If you fail, if the risk does not warrant the benefit, you don't do the experiment. And those are, government rules. Where's the government rules for the NRC? There's a risky experiment with a minimal benefit in supporting the power supply. To me, that risk-benefit ratio doesn't meet the test. The risk is too big and the benefit's too small. So I don't think it should restart. Yeah, I started paying attention to San Onofre as a regional issue when they reinstalled the 2 steam generators a couple of years ago, and I am interested in a lot of science. I'd been working a lot on the Marine Life Protection Act and interacting with scientists at Scripps Institute of Oceanography, the other Scripps Institute. And the initial concern was, why put a power plant on so close to an active fault zone and take the earthquake risk? That risk applies both to San Onofre and El Diablo Canyon nuclear power plants. So that was a risk that I was familiar with. And part of the Marine Life Protection Act investigations I went through was looking at the seafloor profiles, which are much better than they used to be, and highlighted how close these fault zones are to San Onofre. There was also at that time, the issue of whether putting new steam generators in an aging nuclear power plant was cost effective for the ratepayers. And I was paying attention to the fact this was costing an enormous amount of money, and the ratepayers were paying for it, and it wasn't clear that that was a good investment to keep that old nuclear power plant running. Last January, when the first steam generator failed, Unit 3, and I said, what went wrong? We spent all this money, and 11 months after installation of this very expensive new set of steam generators, they fail. This is a lot of money spent, and it doesn't give me any more faith in Southern California Edison than I had, and I never had a whole lot, given their sort of poor safety history, the history of complaints from workers. So then I started really paying attention and hoping that the NRC would get to the root cause, understand what went wrong with these steam generators. And I kept waiting, and every few months Edison would say, well, we're ready to restart and everything's fine, and that made me more anxious. So I tried to get as much information as I could about what had actually happened and why they were in such a rush to restart. July 18th, the NRC issued this report, a preliminary report of all the things that they thought had gone wrong. They didn't actually get to what was the root cause of the failure, but that report was pretty disturbing. It was actually really disturbing when you read it, because it highlighted that the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, who made these steam generators, had never done anything like this before, and there were multiple problems with building these things. The Unit 2 was delivered first, and that was the first one they'd built like that, and they had problems with suppliers, problem with manufacturing processes. Basically, they were just winging it as they were developing the steam generator. And they shipped in, and then they started on Unit 3, and you can read that between the lines on this report that they had thought they had made a lot of errors making the Unit 2 steam generator, so they were going to do a better job on Unit 3, so they started changing a lot of things, and they've They realized they couldn't assemble this thing laying on its side. They had to prop it up a little bit so the tubes didn't sag from gravity. And they went to a new welding technique, which sounded better, but it didn't work. The welds had to be redone. And then finally, they were getting way behind schedule. So it's clear that Southern California Edisons kept saying, hurry up, we need this thing, you're way behind schedule. So they shipped it without testing in Japan. And then somewhere between Japan and California, they dropped the thing. It was shipped with an accelerometer in the packing. It was clear it was dropped somewhere. And Southern California Edison said, okay, we'll take it. You know, it's really late. We need to get it running. We'll take the chance and see whether it works or not. And it's almost, you know, it's like a cartoon story, except it's such a serious issue. So, you know, then they install it. You know, the whole plant was not designed to replace the steam generators, so they had to cut big holes in the side of the containment domes to slide these things in. They put it in. They accept it without testing. It runs for 11 months and it fails. Now they want to restart Unit 2, which is an identical design, had many construction problems, clearly has some of the same tube-to-tube wear indications as the Unit 3 that failed. And Southern California Edison wants to start it and just say, trust us. We've done a good job so far. And the reason I get involved is they haven't done a good job so far, and they're just playing roulette, Russian roulette, with 8.5 million people in Southern California. If you look at the risk-benefit analysis, they're going to produce 700 megawatts, which is 1% of the Southern California grid needs, instead of the 2.2 megawatts that they would do if all units were online. So that's a remarkably small benefit for the level of risk we're accepting. And the only real fix would be to start over again and replace both steam generators with new, better designed, better manufactured steam generators. And that would follow the 800 million that we've already sunk in these steam generators. So this doesn't make safety sense to me, doesn't make economic sense to me, and it's a big risk for all of Southern California that we shouldn't have to accept. We're talking about, I think, a significant risk, and it's one that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission underplays every time. This is more close to my area of expertise. I know, I'm trained in medicine. I know what the radiation risks are. We have used an animal model with radiation from the cesium-137 source where we know what the dose effects are. The real radiation risk that has been documented around nuclear power plants has to do not with naturally occurring radionuclides that we're exposed to when flying in airplanes. It has to do with ingested products like cesium in milk that then gets concentrated somewhere in the food chain. And it's particularly risky to pregnant women who ingest these radionuclides. And then the growing fetus is 100-fold more susceptible to this radiation than an adult. So that's where the damage comes. There's about a 1.6-fold risk of childhood leukemia if you live close to nuclear reactors. These are studies from Europe where there are a lot more nuclear reactors and there's a lot more detailed studies of the radiation risk. In a release, there's also, if there were a big release into the atmosphere, one of the well-documented risks is the release of iodine-131, which gets concentrated in the thyroid. Now that there's about a 6-fold increase in thyroid cancer downwind of 3 Mile Island, the last reactor in the U.S. that had a major release. So that is a well-documented risk. That's the only kind of radiation exposure where there's an antidote. So you can take iodine pills so that your thyroid doesn't absorb, you sort of saturate the thyroid so it doesn't absorb new iodine. And that gives a temporary protection against I-131 exposure. So you have to have it there, and you have to know when to take it. But I'm concerned, the Fukushima disaster would have been much worse if the wind weren't blowing offshore. And we now have radioactive bluefin tuna swimming around the Pacific Ocean just offshore here. And that's because the radionuclides that were emitted there in Fukushima got concentrated in the food chain, and then the bluefin tuna are sort of at the top of the food chain, so they get pretty radioactive, and then their natural circulation pattern is go around the Pacific Ocean, so the ones that were off Japan last March are now off our shores 6 months later. What annoys me about the NRC estimates of radio activity and risk is, first of all, they're 20-fold higher than the Environmental Protection Agency, so they haven't updated their level of risk to reflect the last 20 years of research. The other thing that all the experts in radiation safety now realize is that radiation risk is proportional to radiation exposure. There's no safe threshold. And all the experts in this area agree now that this is true. No level of radiation is safe. And yet the NRC continues to say, well, it's 1 millirem per year threshold, so if you're under that, you don't have to worry. Well, that's not based on any sound science. So we have an industry that's governed by ancient rules that uses designs for nuclear reactors from the 60s and really just hasn't kept up with modern science. So on the radiation safety side, it's a problem. It's also a problem on the side of seismic risk. Right? After Fukushima, the predicted heights of tsunamis, the way you predict from an earthquake size how big a tsunami will be, was realized and published in Science magazine, this magazine right here, but those risks were 3 times too low. The tsunami in Fukushima was 3 times what the experts had predicted, 3 times in heights. So that means the seawall at San Onofre, instead of being 14 foot high, should be 30 foot high. And that, they used the best figures available, back when that plant was constructed in the 60s, but that is totally out of date now. I don't think they should spend the money to raise their seawalls. I think there are many more problems at San Onofre. But it's yet another illustration of how far behind the regulatory authorities are on safety, on design, and on seismic risk. I'm worried that the NRC, which, as you know, is made up of mainly people who have worked in the nuclear industry, is going to approve the restart of Unit 2 without a full public hearing with independent experts, without an evidentiary hearing. And it's a good old boy network where they say just go ahead and do it at the regional level. So I was hoping that this meeting at Dana Point last week would convince Elmo Collins, our regional administrator, that this was a big problem that he needed to kick upstairs. If we go to this full evidentiary hearing, then we're talking about the NRC commissioners, who I think are more responsible than some of the regional administrators, to review this and also hear from all the independent experts. And I think what the public doesn't realize is that there are more nuclear scientists who are in favor of nuclear energy, but who are opposed to restarting Unit 2 than there are people who are in favor of it. So there were some token, nuclear experts who appeared on that panel, and I found their testimony absolutely unconvincing. They were, they were retired nuclear engineers, but we have working nuclear engineers who say they wouldn't restart it. After the meeting, I talked to someone who helped build steam generators for General Electric, and he said he looked at this design and these were just unsafe. He thought it was unethical for Southern California Edison to have installed these and started them up. So there's a wide diversity of opinion among the experts, and there are all the safety concerns. So if you have this wide diversity of opinion, we need a full adjudicatory hearing so that every side can be heard, and hopefully the NRC commissioners can make an informed decision. the other statement that astounded me was one of the nuclear experts, quote, was talking about radiation safety. And first he had his units all wrong, but units of radiation are sort of a complicated subject if you're not in the field. But secondly, he said, low-level radiation is good for you. Did you hear that? That was absurd. I mean, there was one person in one publication years ago that stated this, and that's a total outlier. Nobody in the field believes that. And yet he cited it. One of the reasons I'm concerned about the radiation safety is the field I work in is AIDS research. And when you talk about radiation safety, there's different levels of susceptibility to radiation damage. So I mentioned that developing fetuses are extremely susceptible. But we have a lot of other people who are highly susceptible to radiation damage that we didn't know about 20 or 30 years ago. So people taking AIDS drugs are more sensitive to radiation because the way they inhibit one of the enzymes in the AIDS virus, but they also inhibit a little bit one of the host enzymes in the patient taking the drug. And in fact, the original AIDS drug, AZT, was originally developed as a cancer drug for tumors because it damaged the DNA and led to slowing of the tumor growth. So those people are more sensitive to radiation. Because of better medical care, we have a lot of people with defects in radiation repair, genetic defects that are in our population. Those used to be pretty uniformly fatal diseases, but we've made some major advances in keeping those people alive. And we also have people who've had cancer therapy and been cured that includes both radiation and anti-cancer drugs. And those people are at high risk of secondary cancers, 10 or 20 years out, because they've had some DNA damage because of those drugs. And radiation exposure makes that risk go up considerably. So we have a different population at risk from radiation exposure than the rules were designed to take into account. Women are more susceptible to radiation damage, and one of the reasons that I know about is women have better immune systems than men do. Okay, in the evolution of humans and most species, women are much more important than males. Okay, for reproductive success, and women have evolved to have better immune systems. So that means that when they are challenged with some vaccine or some infection, they generally make a better response than men. But part of that is that their immune system responds quicker, the cells divide more, faster, and when that happens, you also become more radiation sensitive. So that's why, at a basic level, they're more radiation sensitive. Younger children, both male and female, respond better than adults and older people to challenges, and their cells, they tend to have many more dividing cells because they're still developing, and so that makes them more radiation sensitive. Women have autoimmune diseases much more frequently than men, usually 9 to 10 times more frequently, and it's because this more powerful immune system, which is really good for protecting them from infections, also sometimes makes mistakes and attacks your own body. We've got 7 cities along the south coast here the councils have adopted resolutions opposing the restart or asking for a full hearing so that we get independent experts testifying about the restart. And that's pretty amazing to get all these local councils to agree, because some of them are relatively liberal and forward-thinking, and some of them are pretty conservative. And we've got the city of Irvine. This goes far beyond regular politics, far beyond. So there's no Republican or Democratic view on this issue. This is a safety issue that cuts across all party lines. So we have some strange allies in this fight against restarting San Onofre. And I think that's important. I'm also heartened that the LA Times again had a second editorial yesterday opposing the restart. The San Diego Union Tribune, a pretty conservative newspaper that's controlled by, editorially controlled by Doug Manchester, a developer, has come out against restart. We're getting strange bedfellows in this fight against restarting San Onofre, and I think that's important for the public to know. This issue just cuts across all party lines, all kind of preferences. This is a safety issue for the whole region, and I think we're getting close to getting a regional consensus that this is a really bad idea. I can only guess at what Edison's motivation is. It's a business. It's a very privileged business, and it's controlled by the Public Utility Commission, and the ratepayers are on the hook for much of what they do, not their stockholders. Their stockholders are guaranteed a return on the investment. But I think they're rushing to restart so that they don't have to absorb that $54 million a month that we've been charged since January for electricity that they were not producing. So that is adding up to a significant dollar amount. I think they're trying to avoid that and argue their case before the Public Utilities Commission that they don't owe that money back to the ratepayers. That's the only motivation I can imagine. Certainly, we don't need that 700 megawatts now through the winter, and it's doubtful we'll need it next summer. So there's no reason to rush except the monetary incentives for their shareholders. We have the first two nuclear power plants licensed on the East Coast, for development in 30 years, so there's a little positive momentum there. Then we have the district court in D.C. finding that the failure of any real measure for disposing of nuclear waste violates the Environmental Protection Act, so that's got to work its way through the courts. That would be a big negative because no plant has any real way to dispose of nuclear waste, which is radioactive for thousands of years. So that court decision may hold up future development. So the nuclear industry must feel a little battered right now by that decision. We have Japan leaning towards shutting down their nuclear program. That decision is not final, but it's certainly leaning toward closing their nuclear plants. In Germany, they're closing their nuclear plants, phasing them out. France hasn't decided yet. So it's got to be a bellwether time for nuclear power. And I can imagine there were ways with modern technology to make nuclear power safer. We watched a TED event with Bill Gates the other night on a different kind of nuclear reactor that actually burns the used fuel, which looked like it might have some promise in the future and would be much safer. So there are some alternatives that would still use nuclear fuel but wouldn't generate the waste problem. But nobody's invested in this technology for 50 years. So we're using 50-year outdated technology. There may be something in the future that's much safer and wouldn't require water cooling. They could be located in remote areas so they wouldn't impact major population centers. So I think if I were in the nuclear power industry, I'd be worried. But I would be investing in new technologies, not wasting money on old technologies. If anything like Fukushima happened here, the property losses would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars because these heavy radionuclides that get into the ground last forever. They're not going to be able to repopulate that zone within 12 miles of Fukushima, for thousands of years. So if that happened in Southern California, you're looking at a wasteland. Orange County, northern San Diego County would be uninhabitable. That's almost unthinkable to people, but that's what would happen. So that's, my first concern is loss of life and immediate radiation damage, but the property damage and the economic cost would be severe. This year is the first year you can buy milk from cows in Scotland since Chernobyl. So it was a 30-year moratorium on selling milk because of all the radionuclides that got deposited from the Chernobyl disaster. So these impacts last a long time.